How did a small kingdom on the edge of Europe survive against civil wars, palace conspiracies, and Muslim and Viking raids? I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in episode 36, we'll look at the reigns of Alfonso II and Ramiro I, the origins of the Way of St. James, and the rise of Asturian Pre-Romanesque art. Alfonso II of Asturias versus al-Rahman II. We left off the story of the Kingdom of Asturias back in episode 31, the revolt that nearly broke the Umayyads. In the early years of the long reign of Alfonso II of Asturias, the Umayyads tried to completely destroy the small mountain kingdom and reconquer the northern part of the peninsula. But with al-Hakam I and his son al-Rahman II, things changed. Campaigns became smaller in scale and less ambitious. Islamic armies never again marched through Asturias. The goals were now to cause destruction, seize loot, including slaves, and stop Christian territorial expansion. There were few campaigns against the Kingdom of Asturias during al-Rahman II's reign because of revolts in the frontier marches, which for long stretches prevented Umayyad armies from crossing the border. In 823, the veteran general and Hajib Abd-al-Karim ibn Mughith led his last razzia, a minor raid that ravaged Alaba and Castile. Keep in mind that at the time, Castile was essentially part of Cantabria and the northern area of the province of Burgos. In 825, there was a double campaign against the Kingdom of Asturias, a summer expedition against Alaba that was a victory for the Islamic forces, and later, in October or November, the Asturian ruler got word of two Cordoban armies advancing into Galicia. He was able to defeat them separately after they passed through Viseu and Coimbra, which at the time were autonomous areas independent of Asturias and Córdoba. After a short campaign against Castile the following year, there was a break of more than 10 years without campaigns because the usual route through Toledo and Mérida was blocked by rebels. The campaigns of 838, 839, and 840 did cause the usual destruction, but ultimately they were more about reinforcing Umayyad control over the northeastern provinces of the Upper March than about fighting infidels. In response to these attacks, Alfonso II eventually sent an offensive expedition against Medinaceli in the province of Soria, but the son of Musa ibn Musa of the Banu Qasi clan confronted the Christians and defeated them, killing their commander and most of his men. As for internal politics, surprisingly little is known about Alfonso II's reign, despite his 50-year rule. The best-known historical episode from Alfonso II's reign involves a Berber exile from the Emirate of Córdoba. I briefly mentioned in episode 33, al-Rahman II of Córdoba, that after the emir sent an army to subdue the Berbers in the province of Mérida, a Mualad and a Berber named Mahmud ibn Abd-al-Jabbar joined forces to overthrow and kill the Umayyad-appointed governor of Mérida in 828. This governor was the father of Ibn Marwan al-Jiliki, who will become one of the most prominent Mualad rebels, aka Muslims of native descent, of the second half of the 9th century. After the assassination, Emir Abd-al-Rahman II sent an army against the rebels in Mérida. Mahmud's forces held their ground and even raided farther south into the Portuguese Algarve, but they suffered heavy losses in 834. Mahmud and the handful of surviving Berber rebels sought asylum in the Kingdom of Asturias under Alfonso II. According to both the Asturian chronicles and the historian Ibn Hayyan, Mahmud was warmly received by the Asturian ruler and settled his men and their families in central Galicia, strengthening political control and military defense of the region, since after Alaba and Castile, Galicia was a frequent target of Andalusi military campaigns. Perhaps it's thanks to Mahmud's followers and their descendants that Galicians today have more North African ancestry than other Spaniards. Mahmud's fearsome reputation among both Muslims and Christians led to the construction of villages and fortresses between Santiago de Compostela and Lugo, bringing some years of prosperity. But in 840, Mahmud had a change of heart and secretly wrote to the Emir of Córdoba to ask for a pardon. Spies informed Oviedo, and King Alfonso summoned the infidel, intending to force his conversion to Christianity and prevent betrayal. But someone at court tipped off Mahmud, who refused to appear before the king and instead began raiding around Lugo, likely with reinforcements from al-Andalus. The threat was serious because in Córdoba an expedition against Galicia was being prepared, personally led by the emir, and Muhammad took refuge in an easily defensible stronghold to await the Umayyad army. If they had joined forces, they could have caused major damage in the Kingdom of Asturias. An Asturian army hurried to besiege the rebels' stronghold. Arab chroniclers say the daring Mahmud managed to scatter the Christians, but then he accidentally fell from his horse and died. That's how quickly you can end up in the next war without expecting it. Once the Christians confirmed that he was truly dead and it wasn't a trick, they stormed the fortress, killing those who resisted and capturing those who surrendered. Among the captives was Yamila, Mahmud's sister, famed for her beauty and for being a warrior herself. According to Ibn Hayyan, the Christian notables vied to make her their wife. One of them married her, converted her to Christianity, and had several children together, one of whom went on to become Bishop of Iria Flavia, Santiago de Compostela. The origin of the cult of St. James. In the year 820 or 830, a hermit named Payo discovered, somewhere in the far west of Galicia, some ruins with a prominent tomb. According to Jacobean tradition, he was guided there by hearing heavenly voices and seeing strange lights in the forest. Archaeology shows that there had been a small Roman settlement at what is now Santiago de Compostela, abandoned during the upheavals of the 5th century, although the site continued to be used as a cemetery until the 8th century. By the 9th century, it was a relatively remote and deserted place, with the forest swallowing up the old mausoleum and Roman remains, and only a scattered rural population in the area, with a small church nearby. Payo quickly informed Bishop Theodomir of Iria Flavia, who visited the site and identified the tomb as that of the Apostle James the Greater. But how did James, son of Zebedee, end up in Hispania? Wasn't he executed in Jerusalem? Well, that's the issue. As I mentioned back in episode 9, Late Roman Empire and Christianization of Hispania, modern historiography is unanimous in holding that the preaching of James in Hispania and the transfer of his body to Galicia are fabrications without any historical basis.
It's a total fabrication. It never happened. It never happened. This one was invented by a writer. It's false. It's fiction. It's an urban legend that never happened. No way. We got you.
In late antiquity, the idea began to circulate that each apostle had gone to evangelize a particular region of the known world, and the one assigned to the Iberian Peninsula was the apostle James the Greater. The oldest work that mentions this is the Breviary of the Apostles, a Latin text from the late 6th century. A highly respected figure like Isidore of Seville accepted James' preaching as fact, although others, such as Julian of Toledo or Martin of Braga, did not. During the reign of Mauregatus, the writings of the monk Beatus of Liébana show how Asturian Christianity elevated James the Greater as the patron and protector of Hispania, a figure who could safeguard the Kingdom of Asturias, all the Christians of Iberia, and serve as a symbol against the Muslim infidel. In his hymn, O Dei Verbum, Beatus of Liébana wrote, quote, "O most holy and praiseworthy apostle, resplendent golden head of Hispania, our defender and patron, grant us heavenly salvation against plague, and keep from us all illness, wounds, and evil." End quote. By then, it seems widely accepted that James the Greater had evangelized Hispania, and it was believed he was buried somewhere at the far western end of the peninsula, in a place known as Arsis Marmorisis. Theodomir may have thought the toponym referred to a marble chest like the one he found, since the materials of the tomb indicated it belonged to someone of high social status, though their true identity remains unknown. It was from this pious lie, as we might call it, that the Camino de Santiago, or Way of St. James, began, and Santiago de Compostela emerged as the great city of medieval Galicia. Without this lie, the economic development, improvements in communications, or migration and travel across northern Iberia during the Middle Ages wouldn't have happened. Nor would the kings of Asturias and Leon have had a biblical figure in their territory to bolster their legitimacy and political and ecclesiastical independence, just as Rome claimed the tombs of Peter and Paul, or Constantinople that of Andrew. The cult of St. James has been so important that he remains the patron saint of Spain today. Following Bishop Theodomir's quote-unquote discovery, King Alfonso II of Asturias endowed the site with a monastery to protect the cult of James the Greater. This did not involve rebuilding the settlement or reusing the necropolis. Rather, a monastic shrine was established with churches and dependencies surrounding the tomb attributed to the apostle. Alfonso II's buildings were constructed with very simple materials, which is why they were later renovated and expanded by Alfonso III, who was eager to use the apostolic tomb for propaganda purposes. If Alfonso II initially granted only 3 hectares to the shrine and later expanded this to 60 square kilometers, by 915 the land grant had reached almost 1,000 square kilometers or 386 square miles, and it will receive further expansions and privileges until the 13th century. This is how the Lordship of Santiago was formed. In late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, it was common for both secular and ecclesiastical elites in a region to promote the cult of Christian martyrs and saints, as it helped legitimize their political and social control and served to attract settlers and pilgrims. Over time, the cult of St. James drew inhabitants to settle around the pilgrimage site, and the episcopal seat of Iria Flavia effectively moved to Compostela during the reign of Alfonso III. King Ordoño II of Galicia granted a privilege stating that anyone who lived in the city for more than 40 days without being claimed as a serf or a slave would gain the status of a free man and the right to reside in Compostela. Thanks to initiatives from the bishopric of Iria Flavia and the Astur-Leonese monarchy, the area around the monastery was transformed into a town with a strong capacity to attract population. As early as the 860s, Frankish sources were reporting on the Jacobean cult in Compostela. But it wasn't until the 11th century that pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela became famous throughout Europe and had a major impact on the society and economy of northern Spain. Ramiro versus Nepotian for the Asturian throne. When Alfonso II died in 842, over 70 years old and without children, Ramiro, son of King Bermudo, was far from court, getting married for the second time in Castile. According to the Asturian chronicles, the mayor of the palace and a relative of Alfonso, Nepotian, usurped the throne, whereas Ramiro had supposedly been legitimately chosen as King of Asturias by some unknown process. However, there are strong reasons to doubt the chronicles' account here. Nepotian was likely a closer relative of the late ruler than Ramiro. Being the mayor of the palace meant he was second only to the king in power. And it was the same position Alfonso himself had held when he was expected to succeed King Silo. Nepotian had the backing of the Asturians, Cantabrians, and Vascons, and it makes little sense to claim that Ramiro had been chosen king in the Visigothic manner without being in Oviedo, since in the Gothic succession system it was required to be physically present in the capital. As historians like Armando Vesga have argued, everything about this smells like an attempt by Ramiro I's grandson, Alfonso III of Asturias, to legitimize his grandfather's seizure of the throne and avoid casting doubt on his own legitimacy. Thus, Nepotian was in fact the rightful king chosen by Alfonso II to succeed him and backed by most magnates, while Ramiro sought to claim the throne. Without openly rebelling yet, Ramiro withdrew to Galicia, where he had strong support, likely thanks to family connections. It is quite possible that the incident involving Mahmud 2 years earlier played a role in the civil war for the Asturian throne. Galician magnates who from the start had resisted being absorbed into the Kingdom of Asturias could easily have blamed Alfonso II's lineage for a conflict that might never have happened if he had not settled that group of Berbers in Galicia. Recall that even in the distant days of King Fruela, Alfonso II's father, members of the Galician elite had risen against him, and Alfonso II's family ties were oriented toward Vasconia rather than the western part of the kingdom. These factors help explain Galician support for a claimant other than the one designated by the late king. Nepotian reigned for a few months, but Ramiro, who was already around 50 years old, gathered an army in Lugo to invade Asturias. Ramiro's Galician army and Nepotian's forces clashed in the municipality of Cornellana, at the Narcea River crossing. The usurper won the only battle we know of in this Asturian civil war. Nepotian was captured somewhere in eastern Asturias or western Cantabria, blinded and forced into a monastery to make him unable to reclaim the throne according to Visigothic law. Ramiro's triumph represented the victory of the Galician magnates in gaining a share of power and improving their political integration into the Kingdom of Asturias, while still respecting that the royal seat remained in Oviedo. The reign of Ramiro I of Asturias. The reign of Ramiro I of Asturias lasted 7 years, from late 842 until February 850, and it faced challenges both internally and externally. In addition to coming to the throne through a civil war, Ramiro I dealt with 2 palace conspiracies, both of which failed and ended with the conspirators either blinded or executed. Perhaps for this reason, King Ramiro ordered the construction of a new palace, where he dispensed justice, on the slopes of Mount Naranco, about 2 or 3 miles from Oviedo. I'm talking about the Palace of Santa Maria del Naranco, which can still be visited today. It was later converted into a church, but restoration work in the last century returned it to its original appearance. The chronicles call Ramiro the Rod of Justice because he pursued bandits and thieves and had sorcerers burned at the stake. These sorcerers presumably represented the survival of pagan practices in the kingdom's lands. King Ramiro did intervene in the defense of the kingdom during the Viking attack of 844, when the Vikings spent a month raiding the Kingdom of Asturias and its seas. But Ramiro managed to drive them out of Galicia without much difficulty. In the Arab chronicles, Leon reappears in the year 846, which led medievalist Claudio Sánchez Albornoz to hypothesize that King Ramiro had incorporated Leon into the Kingdom of Asturias. However, there is no evidence of this in the Latin sources. At that time, Leon was little more than a cluster of houses loosely put together, essentially a rural village with no ability to project regional power. Recall that after the Islamic conquest, a Berber garrison had been stationed in Leon, but with the Berber revolt of the 740s, that garrison disappeared. Leon, like other settlements in the Douro Basin, was left stateless. The emir sent his son Muhammad against Leon. The crown prince laid siege to the city, and during the night its inhabitants evacuated to the mountains for safety. The next day, the Muslims began looting and burning their homes. The future emir could not bring down the thick Roman-era walls of Leon, but he damaged them as much as he could with catapults before ending the campaign, after spending several more days causing destruction in the area and capturing Christians. As for the reason for the campaign, it may have been that Ramiro tried to advance into the plains of the Meseta Central, and the Umayyads acted quickly to counter this. But it could also have been similar to other attacks on no-man's land towns like Viseu and Coimbra, aimed at bringing them into the emirate. In any case, this action may have led Leon's population to seek the protection of the Asturian monarchy. It was Ramiro's son and successor, Ordoño I of Asturias, who successfully incorporated cities like León and Astorga into the Kingdom of Asturias and restored them to having a bishop. Asturian Pre-Romanesque Art. The term Pre-Romanesque art encompasses all medieval art in Latin Christian Europe from the 6th to the 10th centuries, between early Christian art and the Romanesque style that emerged in the 11th century. It is basically a term for a time period since it includes very different artistic and technical styles. Asturian Pre-Romanesque art can be described as eclectic. In other words, it blends unique and innovative styles not found outside of the Kingdom of Asturias, elements inherited from the native early Christian and late antique tradition, and some decorative features from the Carolingian and Byzantine walls. In present-day Asturias, 15 buildings from the early Middle Ages belonging to this artistic tradition are still preserved. They were closely tied to the political power of Oviedo, which explains their stylistic uniformity. These buildings were modest in size. They were not the grand constructions you might find in the Carolingian, Byzantine, or Abbasid empires. This already tells us something about Asturian society in the early medieval period and about the economic capacity of the Asturian monarchy and the social elites close to it. Asturian Pre-Romanesque art represents the highest expression of power by the monarchy and the Asturian elites, since no comparable monumental construction had existed in the current Principality of Asturias during the late antique period. These buildings served as instruments of political and social control, and as a means for monarchs, aristocrats, and landowners of all kinds to protect or increase their family wealth. They were also a form of legitimization and propaganda for royal power, because at least since the reign of Alfonso II, a key element in the kingdom's ideology was its role in restoring the Catholic Church after the Islamic conquest. That restoration also required building many churches, which could serve either as monasteries or as oratories. Many more churches must have been built by local elites in each area, or even by local communities without any intervention from Oviedo, especially outside Asturias. Unfortunately, little has survived from the 8th to 10th centuries, a time when, incidentally, it was still not common to have a church in every village, and they were mostly made of wood. Although there was technical diversity in Asturian architecture due to the kingdom's varied regions, the Asturian monarchy promoted temples of similar size and floor plan, and above all, ornamental elements in sculpture and painting that spread throughout the kingdom. In art history, Asturian Pre-Romanesque art from Asturias, and to some extent Galicia and Cantabria, is usually distinguished from the so-called Mosarebic art of the Douro Valley, County of Castile, and La Rioja. However, this division is doubtful as a stylistic criterion and seems more influenced by outdated ideas about Spanish medieval history. For example, architecture featuring alfiz frames and horseshoe arches is often labeled as Mosarebic, but the truth is that these were already in use during the Visigothic period, so they did not necessarily come from Islamic influence. In any case, that style is a continuation of earlier traditions, while in Asturian art, the horseshoe arch is very rare, perhaps partly because Asturias was never part of the Visigothic kingdom. The question of whether we should revise the classification of pre-Romanesque styles in Iberia remains open. The only thing we can say for certain is that the style of Asturias itself is more uniform and easier to categorize than the more diffuse styles of other parts of the kingdom. Speaking of classification, the frequent lack of decoration and the use of simple masonry, or more rarely ashlar stonework, makes it difficult to date accurately most Iberian pre-Romanesque buildings. Setting aside the few surviving examples of secular buildings, Asturian pre-Romanesque architecture generally features very regular floor plans, with fairly small basilica-type buildings, rectangular in shape, with 3 apses, each containing its own chapel and altar, and vaulted construction with semicircular arches rather than the typical Visigothic or Islamic horseshoe arches. Some churches have a main entrance on the west side with a portico, along with 2 side doors. Based on baptismal ceremonies, it has been suggested that these side doors serve to separate believers by sex right at the entrance, men entering through the north side door, women through the south. In any case, it seems that all churches segregated men and women inside. One feature that disappears in Asturias after the late antique period is the separate baptistery, which had its own space, and burials inside the church also ceased, except for a few privileged tombs for bishops or other elite figures. From the period before Ramiro I, Asturian art is notable for its aniconism, that is, the refusal to represent God and other religious figures in images. This is because the debate over whether to depict God, prophets, and saints, which is better known in the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world, also took place across Western Europe. Churches and palaces were decorated with interior and exterior murals, continuing an ancient tradition that was fading in the rest of Europe. During the reign of Alfonso II, there were no human figures, as seen in the church of San Julián de los Prados. By contrast, in Ramiro's time, depictions of humans and angels as symbols of royal power, law, and the church became central themes, as seen in San Miguel de Lillo or the Royal Hall of Santa Maria del Naranco. To conclude, I think it's worth talking about the most important castle in the Kingdom of Asturias, Gauzón Castle. Located a little west of Gijón, overlooking the Avilés estuary, it was only a day's journey from Oviedo, therefore in a very strategic location. Studying this archaeological site required understanding its paleo-environmental history, because today the rock where the castle ruins stand is 700 meters from the sea, but in the Middle Ages it was directly on the coast, guarding the mouth of the Avilés estuary. The site already had late antique precedents, and much of the castle of Gauzón was built before the reign of Alfonso III, beginning in the late 8th century. Alfonso III later expanded the original fortress with a church and palace, monumentalizing it with a stone construction at a time when most European fortresses were still made of wood. This decision may have been driven by both a desire to give the royal castle greater grandeur and to strengthen defenses against Viking attacks. Monumental construction was closely linked to the assertion of political power, as we see in the expansion of the Kingdom of Asturias. For example, we find no monumental buildings from this era in the Douro Basin. Wherever the Asturian king's authority reached, they sponsored the construction of churches, monasteries, and other monumental buildings, things that more local or regional elites could not rival. Gauzón Castle served as an administrative, military, and port center for the Asturianese monarchy. Nearby salt works were exploited, and it controlled local populations as well as several churches and monasteries, many of which still exist today and originated in this period. Its port collected tolls, and ships and goods passed in and out. This was also the fortress where the Victory Cross, now an icon of the Principality of Asturias, was made, since Gauzón had a metalworking space to supply the demands of the Asturian elites. For the monarchy, bishops, and great landowners, the goal was the same: to dominate a territory. Fortresses on elevated sites were an expression of aristocratic control, a phenomenon that was gradually spreading across Europe, laying the groundwork for the development of feudal society.
The verdict!
In today's verdict, I would like to reflect on the power of a lie, how an idea that is originally an unfounded invention can come to be accepted as truth, with real-world consequences. I have spoken many times about the negative effects of nationalism, which creates opposing identities and violence, and in its most extreme cases leads to terrorism, war, and genocide. However, sometimes a lie can guarantee peace and economic development without harming anyone in particular, and I think this applies to the origin of the Way of St. James. And you? Can you think of other examples of lies that have had positive consequences in history? I look forward to your responses in the YouTube comment section. And with that, the verdict ends. That's the end of today's episode. If you found it interesting and you are new here, please subscribe to the show wherever you listen to it. You can help me keep this project going by making a donation or becoming a Patreon. This way you will get perks like early access, exclusive merch, or credit appearances in the video. Links are in the description. In the next episode, we'll look at the political history of the Emirate of Córdoba in the 850s, when Emir Muhammad was beginning to lose control over the provinces of al-Andalus. Thanks for listening, and see you soon!